The Russian Air Force is collapsing, not retreating, not rearming, collapsing. 3 years into the war, Russia, once expected to dominate the skies, is running out of jets, pilots, and options. What was supposed to be an overwhelming advantage has turned into a slow-motion disaster. Catastrophic losses, engine failures, aircraft pulled from museums and scrapyards. And now US intelligence says Russia's air power may never fully recover. This isn't just about jets being shot down, it's about an entire system breaking under the weight of war, corruption, and decades of bad doctrine. So what happened? How did Russia lose its edge in the skies, and what does that mean for the future of modern warfare? Let's break it down. This problem for Russia didn't really start in 2022, as a more dedicated analysis shows symptoms of this far before the conflict between the two countries started. But let's start by examining the most visible and discernible symptom of Russia's air power crisis: direct combat losses. According to meticulous documentation by the open-source intelligence site Oryx, Russia has lost at least 141 fixed-wing military aircraft that have been visually confirmed as destroyed, damaged, or captured. This includes frontline fighters like the Su-35S, bombers like the Su-34, and various other tactical aircraft such as transports and radar or airborne early warning and control aircraft. This represents around 10% of Russia's total fleet size before the war started. The 10% figure here is important, as a double-digit loss rate of an entire system such as the Air Force would start eating away at Russia's ability to conduct airstrikes and exert localized air superiority over its own skies. Due to Russia having a significantly larger land area than Ukraine, its aircraft need to cover much larger distances to patrol the skies or respond to long-range strikes deeper into Russia's territory. Given that Ukraine has steadily increased its capacity to launch drones deeper into Russia and with greater precision, managing to take out 10% of Russia's air force would further degrade the latter's ability to mount a layered anti-air defense system. But the visually confirmed losses represent only part of the story. Ukrainian military sources claim to have downed over 340 Russian planes and as many helicopters by early 2024, only 2 years into the war. These figures could have been inflated for propaganda, morale, and geopolitical purposes, as they are pretty much impossible to verify, given that Russia will practically never admit to the true extent of its losses in Ukraine. At best, we might get the precise scale of the casualty and loss rates years after the conflict is over and the documentation is revealed. But given that Oryx only counts verified, damaged, and downed aircraft, chances are many more planes were damaged, but without explicit imagery to corroborate that fact. As such, it's likely the true number of aircraft Russia has lost lies somewhere in between these two figures, pointing at above a 10% loss rate. What makes these losses particularly devastating isn't just their quantity, but their quality. Russia has lost a solid percentage of its most advanced aircraft. These are the planes that require years of manufacturing and highly trained pilots who need thousands of flight hours to reach combat proficiency. The Su-34 fallback strike fighter provides a telling example. This advanced aircraft, which entered service in 2014, was supposed to be Russia's premier precision strike platform. With an approximate unit cost of $36 million and a production rate of only about 6 aircraft per year, Russia has lost at least 37 confirmed Su-34s. If Russia can consistently churn out as many of these aircraft as it can lose, then there's no real problem here. But the truth is much more complicated. For one, the visible losses of aircraft shot down over Ukraine represent only the tip of an iceberg. Behind the scenes, Russia's remaining aircraft fleet is deteriorating at an alarming rate due to what military analysts call imputed losses. These are the cumulative effects of overuse, inadequate maintenance, and parts shortages. According to a RAND Corporation analysis from late 2023, Russian combat aircraft were flying 3 to 4 times their intended annual flight hours throughout the war. These come from the fact that Russia has been using them to deploy glide bombs, which we'll cover a bit later, and from the fact that Russian airstrips are located further away from the front line than Ukraine's. The increased usage of the aircraft directly goes against the traditional doctrine of aerial warfare, that being modern fighter jets designed for specific operational tempos, i.e. flight hours per year, with maintenance schedules built around expected usage patterns. When these limits are exceeded, aircraft are more likely to experience catastrophic failures on several systems, which makes them an outright liability in the grander scale of the conflict. This overuse is compounded by Russia's increasingly desperate tactics. To avoid Ukrainian air defenses, Russian pilots fly at extremely low altitudes, putting tremendous stress on airframes and engines. These high-stress flight profiles accelerate wear on critical components, particularly engines, which are already Russia's most significant maintenance bottleneck. The Su-35S, Russia's most advanced operational fighter, utilizes Saturn AL-41F1S engines that require maintenance after approximately 1,000 flight hours under normal conditions. The total lifespan of the engines used by the Su-35, a relatively modern fighter, ranges from 4,000 to 6,000, depending on the exact model of the engine used. However, 1,000 hours is the generally accepted rate at which the engine needs to be rechecked completely, which can ground the airplane for weeks at a time. However, those operating conditions posit a near-perfect flight environment and operations, far from what is happening in Ukraine. Instead, Russian aircraft need to either surface skim to avoid long-range radar, repeatedly use their afterburners to achieve high speeds to evade Ukrainian countermeasures, or maneuver around the Ukrainian airspace entirely when deploying medium-range weapons. Flying close to the ground generates more heat and allows the craft to intake more debris, which has been shown to have a noticeable reduction in lifespan. For example, F-16s flying in Syria had their lifespan reduced by 20% by taking on sand during takeoff procedures in the desert. Something similar is likely happening to Russian aircraft, even if it's on a smaller scale. And even if an aircraft takes damage and manages to return, its radar cross-section can be suddenly modified due to the broken stealth coating or deflecting pattern. This makes an aircraft more likely to be picked up by radar, which severely increases the risk of engagement. In response, technicians need to either patch the damage, which provides only a limited repair and restoration of the original cross-section, or prioritize fixing the outside of the aircraft at the expense of maintaining the engine and electronics. Furthermore, the long lifespan of the engine applies to only the newest models. The Su-34, for example, has the older version of the Saturn AL-31F engine, which has an estimated lifespan of only 1,500 hours and has been in use for more than a decade. The country is also still in the process of modernizing its fleet, with half of the aircraft used in Ukraine being holdovers from the Soviet Union. These aircraft have already been in use for decades, which suggest that they're literally on their last few hundred hours of flight time remaining on the engine alone. RAND's analysis of all Russian jets suggests that its air force is flying at around 75% of its pre-war strength. RAND estimated that frequent sorties have resulted in engine degradation to the point where Russia lost another 60 aircraft. And this figure is from late 2023, only a year and a half into the war. A Polish military news website suggested in 2024 that around 45% of Russian jets are approaching the end of their lifespan and would need to be decommissioned in the coming years, with 60 jets likely needing to be decommissioned in 2024 alone. Russia could try to maintain some of them to give them a year or two, but that's not a surefire long-term solution. Even if Russia slowed down the use of its aircraft by a third, which RAND posited, after 2 years of flying at high tempo, it's still using aircraft at nearly double the recommended rates. 3 years into the conflict, Russia could have lost as many as 80 to 100 aircraft to imputed losses, and this figure only grows with each passing month. To make matters worse, Western sanctions have severely restricted Russia's access to specialized materials and precision manufacturing equipment needed for engine maintenance. The result is a maintenance crisis that quietly grounds more aircraft than Ukrainian missiles and anti-air defenses do. This maintenance crisis extends beyond just engines. Modern fighter aircraft depend on thousands of components with specific replacement schedules. As sanctions restrict access to these parts, Russian maintenance crews could be cannibalizing more critical aircraft to keep others flying, further compounding the loss rates of the war. These needs extend to both newer and older aircraft for slightly different purposes. For older planes, replacement parts are simply not being made at scale, with most of the planes being scheduled for part upgrades. But if the underlying system doesn't get upgraded as well, newer parts might not fit or perform as expected. For newer planes, the parts in question might require technology or imported materials that have since been restricted or stopped being flown in altogether. The latter part has been more evident in Russia's commercial aircraft, with more than half of its A320 passenger fleet non-operational due to a parts shortage. But even before a single shot was fired in this war, Russia's aerospace industry was already compromised by a cancer eating away at its foundations, systemic corruption, and quality control failures. In July 2024, a damning report emerged that Russia had been forced to pull 5 of its 18 Il-76 MD-90A aircraft from service after discovering they contained substandard parts. According to Kommersant, Russia's state media outlet, inspections revealed critical components that failed to meet basic specifications, including parts made from inferior materials that could lead to catastrophic failures. This wasn't an isolated incident. In May 2025, Kommersant published details of a government investigation into aircraft manufacturing that found widespread fraud at multiple production facilities. The report described schemes where contractors substituted low-quality materials while charging for premium components, with kickbacks distributed throughout the supply chain. The corruption extends beyond just materials. Electronic systems, particularly the radar and avionics that give modern fighters their combat edge, have shown alarming failure rates. Ukrainian intelligence has reported Russian jets with commercial GPS systems strapped to the dashboard to provide a secondary navigation source, indicating that pilots were aware they were flying machines on borrowed time. These quality control failures represent more than just isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a military-industrial complex that prioritizes embezzlement and kickbacks over combat effectiveness. The result is an air force equipped with aircraft that look impressive on paper but suffer from critical reliability issues that could explain how Russia has failed to achieve its objectives in Ukraine for so long. But Russia's air power crisis isn't just about hardware failures, but also due to a fundamentally flawed doctrine that has left pilots ill-prepared for the challenges they now face. To understand this doctrinal failure, we need to examine how the Russian Air Force was designed to fight versus the war it's actually fighting. Russian aerospace doctrine evolved primarily around a defensive concept, protecting Russian airspace against NATO incursions. This led to a highly centralized command structure where ground-based controllers direct aircraft to intercept threats or launch offensive missions. Russian pilots were trained to follow specific instructions rather than exercise independent tactical judgment. This centralized approach made sense in a defensive scenario where ground radar networks could identify incoming threats and vector interceptors accordingly. But it's proved disastrously unsuited to offensive operations over enemy territory, where pilots need to make split-second decisions without constant ground guidance. According to a study published by Air University, the US Air Force's academic institution, Russian tactical aviation was never properly integrated with other combat arms in a way that would allow effective close air support or battlefield interdiction missions. Instead, Russian military exercises focused on set-piece scenarios that rarely reflected the fog of war encountered in Ukraine. This doctrinal downfall became immediately apparent in the war's opening days. Russian pilots, accustomed to operating under constant ground control, found themselves unable to effectively coordinate with ground forces or adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The result was pilots flying in predictable patterns that made them vulnerable to Ukrainian air defenses. Furthermore, Russian pilots lacked the training hours necessary to develop the proficiency needed for complex combat operations. While NATO fighter pilots typically accumulate 180 to 240 flight hours annually, their Russian counterparts historically receive less than half that amount. This training deficit means Russian pilots lack the muscle memory and instinctive reactions needed in high-stress combat environments. The situation has deteriorated further as experienced pilots have been lost and replacements rushed through abbreviated training programs. According to Ukrainian intelligence reports, Russia has shortened its fighter pilot training program from 5 years to less than 2, with significant reductions in actual flight hours, further degrading pilot quality. Faced with mounting losses and maintenance issues, Russia has been forced to adapt its approach with mixed results. The most significant adaptation has been the widespread adoption of glide bombs as Russia's primary air-to-ground weapon. These relatively simple munitions, which are essentially conventional bombs fitted with wings and basic guidance packages, allow Russian aircraft to launch attacks from beyond the range of most Ukrainian air defenses. As early as August 2023, glide bombs have become Russia's weapon of choice, with dozens deployed daily across the front lines. By staying at a high altitude and approximately 30 to 50 miles from Ukrainian positions, Russian aircraft could release these weapons with minimal risk of interception. This approach trades precision for aircraft survivability. While modern precision-guided weapons can strike within meters of their targets, glide bombs typically have circular error probabilities measured in dozens or even hundreds of meters. This lack of precision has led Russia to compensate with quantity, dropping multiple bombs on a single target to ensure destruction. Russia increased the rate of glide bomb attacks 16-fold between 2023 and 2024, and their prevalence indicates that the system is either working or has become the only viable option. Either way, the glide bombs seem to have become Russia's way of slowly advancing through Ukraine, even if some estimates suggest that this would take well over a century at the rate shown between 2024 and 2025. Russia has also begun returning older aircraft to service, including Su-24 bombers and MiG-29 fighters that have been in storage. According to the satellite imagery shown by Ukrainian intelligence, Russia has reactivated dozens of previously mothballed aircraft as early as October 2022. These older platforms lack the capabilities of modern jets but are easier to maintain with domestically produced parts. While they may not be able to go toe-to-toe with Ukrainian aircraft, they should be able to deploy the glide bombs that have become core to the country's military strategy. In perhaps the clearest sign of desperation, Russia has begun producing new copies of the A-50 airborne early warning aircraft, which is a design dating back to the Soviet era. While technologically outdated compared to modern AWACS platforms, the A-50 can be manufactured entirely with domestic components, making it immune to Western sanctions. These adaptations have allowed Russia to maintain some semblance of air operations, but they represent a significant degradation of capabilities compared to pre-war expectations. What was once envisioned as a modern air force capable of precision strikes and complex operations has devolved into a force primarily focused on lobbing glide bombs from safe distances. It's definitely not the surgical precision and aerial dominance that pre-war military analyses suggested. It's worth noting that Ukraine faces similar challenges, albeit on a different scale and with different causes. Ukraine's pre-war air force was even smaller than Russia's and has suffered its losses throughout the conflict. While Ukrainian officials rarely publish exact figures, independent analysts estimate Ukraine has lost at least 70 combat aircraft since February 2022. Unlike Russia, Ukraine has received Western aircraft to bolster its capabilities, including F-16 fighters from NATO countries. However, these donations face significant limitations. The number remains relatively small compared to wartime needs. Ukraine received around 80 F-16s, as well as only 6 French Mirage 2000s, with another dozen suggested to arrive by the end of 2025. This is less than 100 total aircraft. Furthermore, training Ukrainian pilots to effectively operate these complex platforms takes considerable time, with full combat proficiency requiring years rather than the months being spent on Ukrainian pilots. Ukraine also faces the challenge of maintaining complex Western aircraft under wartime conditions. Remember that study on F-16s facing shortened lifespans due to harsh conditions? Well, it can directly affect Ukrainian jets, as they were already approaching decommission from their native countries even before they went on to conduct daily sorties in Ukraine. Like their Russian counterparts, Ukrainian pilots are flying more hours than sustainable, leading to accelerated wear on both aircraft and crews. The pressure to perform offensive operations, particularly to support ground forces in contested areas, forces Ukrainian aircraft to operate in high-threat environments that increase both mechanical stress and combat risk. However, Ukraine has demonstrated greater adaptability in tactics and doctrine. Drawing on Western training and their own combat experience, Ukrainian pilots have developed effective low-altitude techniques and creative approaches to modern warfare. This has resulted in Ukraine creating pockets of localized air superiority, which has allowed it to invade Russian territory not once, but at least twice during the war. Beyond the immediate battlefield implications, Russia's air power failures raise profound questions about the future of aerial warfare in an age of sophisticated air defenses. For decades, air power theorists have emphasized the decisive role of air superiority in modern warfare. The United States' experience in conflicts from Desert Storm to Afghanistan seemed to confirm this view, with control of the skies serving as a prerequisite for ground operations. However, the war in Ukraine has demonstrated that dense, layered air defense networks can effectively neutralize even numerically superior air forces. The combination of long-range systems like the S-300 and S-400, medium-range mobile platforms like Buck M1s, and short-range man-portable systems creates an interlocking defensive network that makes traditional air operations prohibitively costly. This reality challenges fundamental assumptions about military operations that have guided Western doctrine since the end of the Cold War. The Pentagon has grown accustomed to operating in environments where air supremacy is a given, rather than a daily struggle against capable opponents. It's worth noting that even when the United States achieved near-complete air dominance during the War on Terror, this advantage didn't translate into strategic victory. American aircraft could strike targets at will across Afghanistan and Iraq, yet controlling the skies didn't automatically lead to controlling the ground or achieving political objectives. The lessons for modern militaries will likely be tallied for decades to come. Of course, traditional measures of air power, fleet size, aircraft sophistication, pilot training hours, budgets, and investments remain important. However, they don't paint the full picture when pitted against adversaries with robust, multi-layered defenses. The future may belong to unmanned systems, standoff weapons, and integrated air defense suppression tactics rather than traditional fighter-bomber operations. For NATO planners watching Ukraine closely, the implications are particularly significant. If Russia's air force, which was once considered the second most powerful in the world, can be effectively neutralized by a smaller opponent with determination and modern defenses, traditional assumptions about the balance of power in Europe may need re-evaluation. This doesn't mean manned aircraft are obsolete, but it does suggest their roles and employment concepts will continue to evolve away from direct battlefield engagement. Instead, as Russia has done with glide bombs, aircraft might lean more into specialized missions where their unique capabilities can combine with low-cost weapon systems to tip the scales in one side's favor. What do you think about these developments? Will Russia's failure to achieve air supremacy usher in a new era of modern warfare strategy? And are traditional fighter jets doomed to only be useful in asymmetric warfare scenarios? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you, as always, for watching.